Hi, I'm Emily Tector, and I'm the project coordinator for Situating Science. Welcome to the podcast. This is the first episode in a series of podcasts complementing the Lives of Evidence National Lecture Series. The recent warnings about the death of evidence raise key questions about the nature and role of evidence. Speakers in the National Lecture Series explore the cultural, ethical, political, and scientific role of evidence in our world. Today we are chatting with Dr. Cindy Patton. She is a professor in the Department of Sociology and Anthropology at Simon Fraser University. Dr. Patton is also an associate member in the Department of Gender, Sexuality, and Women's Studies. Her research focuses on social studies of medicine with a special interest in AIDS, bioethics, research design, and the history of sexuality. Dr. Patton's talk entitled The Press and the Press Release, Inventing the Crystal Meth HIV Connection, was held on February 3rd at UBC and February 5th at the University of Saskatchewan. Her talk launches the National Lecture Series. All right. Well, thank you for joining us, Dr. Patton.
It's my pleasure.
So I just have a few questions related to your talks that you're traveling from BC and Saskatchewan here. First is maybe more broad question related to the title of your talk, to give people a sense of why you chose the word invention in your press and press release, inventing the crystal meth HIV connection. I imagine there's a lot of value in the use of that term. Can you give us a little bit of insight on to why that use of that term?
I guess it's a kind of conceptual framework I've used before and used in other work. I think it derives in part from Ludwig Fleck's work in the genesis and development of a scientific fact, which will be well known to people in science and technology studies as a kind of central text. There's also some Foucauldian inflected post-colonial studies work, probably from the early to mid-90s, that was using this kind of conceptual framework. So the implication is that they're a social phenomenon or biomedical phenomenon, but their reality, their seeming realness to us is part of a series of processes. And so in this piece, what I'm trying to do is give a sense of the kinds of source materials and what were the scientific references that were in fact in play as this idea that crystal meth and HIV are linked came to be consolidated in many people's minds. I think probably most people today would still say that that linkage was clearly established and we can just proceed from there.
Okay. And for those who don't know Ludwig Fleck's work and your reference to that, what would be that? Not to go in too much detail, but
yeah, Fleck's work was lost for a long time because he was actually interned in a concentration camp, and so he did this work in the mid-1930s. He was essentially a physician and laboratory scientist, and something of a philosopher. It seems like he was reading Karl Mannheim. It's not entirely clear who all of his own intellectual sources were. But he basically shows how the conceptualization of a medical phenomenon or a disease, in his case he's looking at syphilis, is kind of a hybrid assemblage of existing kind of social stereotypes and ideologies about the kind of people that get the thing, along with whatever the theory of medicine is at a given point in time in combination with technology. And so he traces the kind of movement of syphilis through the 1930s when he ends up going off to the camps. And he's able to show that it's not just the laboratory training, it's not just the medical training or the scientific training, but it's also the scientists' and doctors' own ordinary ideas about the world that become part of the conceptual framework. Okay. It's a very sophisticated argument. It's not saying, oh, scientists have prejudices too. It's that there's a kind of analogic process that might occur. The idea of tacit knowledge is another way of thinking about this, that we bring forms of knowledge that we can't quite codify or specify, and often can't even recognize for ourselves. So Pierre Bourdieu would be another person with this same kind of conceptual framework. So there's a number of people that can kind of across sociology or social theory that are willing to hold in tension the idea that there are different sources of knowledge that don't ever get kind of finally logically rationalized into something called science with a capital S.
Okay.
So that's it in a nutshell.
Yeah. And then Foucault, is there that strong link between?
Foucault's kind of a dead daddy for me. I love him. I would say today, I've always used his work. The thing that's important, I always remind people, is that he's a historian who, when his work came to North America, he came into comparative literature programs primarily initially at a time when high theory was the happening thing. So he gets written as a theoretician in North America. And so a bit of damage is done to his work, to the empirical strength of his work, but also some things that are working vocabulary for him in the course of a particular project take on a kind of life of their own. So biopower is one. He actually doesn't develop the concept of biopower very much. He sort of drops it and writes around it and does 4 years worth of lectures, which are supposed to end with a theory of biopolitics, but it's not really. It's really a very careful empirical investigation into a shifting set of power relations that end up involving medical processes and scientific processes.
And it's taken a life of its own now.
As if biopower is a kind of theory that you could just sort of
throw in and it encompasses.
Yeah,
it's like a black box of.
I think for me, Foucault, the pieces of Foucault that I still find the most important are the work that he does on the 19th century when notions of population take on administrative kind of traction in institutions and organizations that have been in charge of actually doing something or other with this entity called a population. So some of the work I've been doing is thinking through and looking at some case studies, in looking at them from an ethical point of view about the way that the right and status of a population comes to replace the right and status of an individual. So a lot of the current bioethical debates don't recognize the complexity and the historical trajectory that resulted in these two kind of competing entities.
For your talk and looking at the AIDS meth link and bringing this all to bear on this.
To a concrete case.
Yeah, to a concrete case. At first, it's quite a controversial or stimulating, what's the word, title. In that if you go on any AIDS research site or society, there are fact sheets of the link between HIV and crystal meth use for reasons that are linked to unprotected, uninhibited sex while under the influence, or increasing the risk of transmission, or the fact that there's injection use, not all the time, but sometimes with crystal meth. So how do you, I'm assuming your talk is going to be countering these claims. So in what ways does that get unraveled?
Yeah, I think this particular case, the HIV Crystal case, is very, very similar to the ways in which other truisms within AIDS policymaking and program development have been invented, to come back to that term.
Right.
So structurally, it has many of the same characteristics. So it becomes, I actually started working on this right in the moment it was happening in 2005, and it had an unhappy publication trajectory. I'd done it for what was supposed to be a new journal on sex in the city, so that had pushed the analysis in a particular direction. So after I agreed to do this talk, I was like, it's a great case, but it's the wrong kind of approach for this particular project that you guys are doing. I went back and kind of rethought it against the other case studies I've done that are similar ones on kind of problems in AIDS research. So there was a bunch of stuff around meth going on, which was really about the redneck meth epidemic. To some extent, the suburban women who were using it to lose weight epidemic, which was never quite written about in the same, we're all going to die because these people are doing this thing. It was more in the protective rhetoric of our nice girls in the suburbs are using these drugs. In 2005, late 2004, early 2005, there was a guy in New York who was about 40-something, who was understood to rapidly progress from HIV infection to frank expression of AIDS. He was using crystal meth. So the New York Department of Public Health, after some, what should we do about this, decides that they'll announce this. It was a huge media story. At that time, there was a whole bunch of work being done in neurobiology. In the early 2000s, the NIH started funding a lot of your brain and drugs kind of research and public presentation. So I went to a bunch of these, NIH guys would be there with all their slides. And it was a very kind of cartoonish and maybe not well thought through piece of translational science to providers they thought were too stupid to really understand all this stuff. So it was very, very kind of dumbed down stuff. So there was a lot of exposure to the idea that drugs might cause a neurological problem. Coincidentally, there was also work on HIV and dementia going on at the time, and these two things got immediately conflated. So one of the lines of research became, does crystal meth somehow cause AIDS dementia? So just about any line of research you can imagine sort of gets taken up. In 2004, just before this New York case, there was a very heavily promoted article that's essentially a literature review of all this haphazard research. It is headlined, Crystal Meth Increases Risk of HIV. And I'll go through this in more detail in the talk, but that was widely picked up by these little specialty newsletters that are kind of a cottage industry for usually Ph.D. science people who aren't working as scientists in the industry. So they do this kind of translational journalism for lab techs, different medical specialties. So it's not for lay people. And basically what they do is they kind of pass on press releases. They rarely do any individual work. So this press release on HIV, crystal meth and HIV linkage comes out in 2004. So when the New York Department of Public Health has this, what is called the superbug, David Ho, who's just recently at that point won the Time Man of the Year award, is part of the lab team looking at this guy. What they're really interested in is the fact that this guy contracted an already drug-resistant strain of HIV. Up until that point, the thinking about drug resistance was that you got a kind of pristine virus or retrovirus. You really have to realize HIV is like a hunk of information. So it's not like conceptually, it's not like a bacteria or something where it gets better and moves on. So this was all kind of confusing at the time. So David Ho's lab and a number of other people were looking at these cases of people who apparently got already had gotten drug-resistant virus. So that's what the scientists were interested in. What the New York Public Health Department and all the media people take from that is, oh my God, it's a superbug. It's going to come and kill us all. Gay men should be terrified. There's this virus that will defeat all drugs, and it's going to come and get you all. And it's linked to crystal meth. So the story was just very explosive. The local AIDS organizations, including Gay Men's Health Crisis, who was doing a crystal meth addictions program, there were tons of people who were like, yeah, this is a problem, but it's not that kind of problem. So the people who were aware of the kind of perpetual turnover of party drugs that go on in communities of people that use drugs in that way, and the problem of HIV resistance were problems, but they weren't linked problems. it was like just days before the other side just were calling up and saying, this is crazy, this is not news, we've all got these kinds of cases, yeah, that's a really rapid progression, but, we've seen this before, so you have to figure out why, like what else is wrong with this person, you can't just announce this as a superbug. Nevertheless, it generated a huge amount of publicity. So incrementally over the next few months, different pieces of the story are essentially debunked. Some quite sensationally. So the New York Times, which had launched the story and did 2 articles before they were like, whoops, they ran a couple of pieces on kind of competition within science over breaking stories. There's only one criticism of the science itself, or rather of the reporting itself, and that's done by a woman from the Columbia Journalism Review. And she's the only reporter that actually looked at the epidemiology. And she noted that the apparent recent increase in HIV cases was primarily among young African American men, while the increase in crystal meth use was among like more upper class party circuit white men. So she's like, you need to show what the connection between these 2 groups is if you're going to argue that the drug causes the HIV increase. So each little piece of this kind of type formulation, superbug, HIV, drug, each piece kind of chipped away. AIDS Committee of Toronto was doing a lot of work on party culture, and they too came out and said, look, it's not this straightforward. There have been plenty of drugs before they come in. People don't know how to manage them, and then fairly soon people start doing informal harm mitigation processes. They'll come up with new rules for practicing safe sex. So, oops, my old rules didn't work. This drug's different than that drug. I need to make sure X, Y, or Z. This drug in itself is different, so I have to do X, Y, and Z, and my, what I do when I'm having sex is different. So, and we knew this from the early research on alcohol, which was the first drug in the mid-'80s that was said to cause higher infection rates. And then men adapted to using alcohol and can practice safe sex perfectly well using alcohol. So this is something that people who've been around know. But no one ever challenged the fundamental premise of all of this work, which is gay men can't control themselves. And so essentially, even though all the science gets picked away, this basic question of, is that actually a good characterization of this community of people, was never asked in the whole process. Even though there were 2 research teams, at least, that were, University of New South Wales had also been doing work for like 15 years, 20 years, on sort of how do sex-drug cultures function together. There was work in sociology long before that on other groups that use drugs.
Right. And so rhetoric coming into the press, the media aspect of this, how much weight is that given in terms of the evidence or lack of thereof in this whole story?
I think this is probably one of my least rhetorically developed pieces. I've done other works where I looked in quite a bit of detail at the exact framing of whatever the disease was. I've done some work on H1N1, and I'm doing some work on TB now. So this particular piece, when I read some of the texts, particularly the mainstream media texts, it'll be kind of like, oh my God, it's very rhetorically interesting stuff. But I think what this particular paper's main goal is to look at how kind of quasi-facts, iffy science, just kind of sediments into an idea that has quite a bit of longevity, right. Even though upon further examination by scientists and clinicians and other people who were involved in one part of this question or another, the linkages just aren't there. They're just not there. And then this piece will probably also be part of, I'm trying to do a history of the idea that gay men can't behave themselves.
Yeah.
Essentially.
Because that's what comes out through those when I'm looking at fact sheets of the link exists, and here's why, but it's a very weak behavioral based link.
Yeah, and so there has to be some other presumption. If you're willing to go with such a weak linkage, you have to be already assuming something else, or you'd be asking a whole bunch of questions. And I think that assumption is that gay men will always put themselves at risk.
Or is there something to do with activism, or the role of activism in all of this, where there's something like this that comes out proclaiming a link, and that do you see that in this case, where maybe not activism, but like you say, interest groups or groups take this on as kind of a call to arms on either AIDS or crystal meth, and in this case both at the same time?
Yeah.
That can be quite powerful.
Yeah, people won't like me for kind of raising this question, right. But I think you have to recognize the kind of bureaucratized interests, and there are competing bureaucratized interests. Public health and the anti-addiction, harm reduction organizations that get involved in this, and the kind of gay community-based AIDS organizations that get involved in this, each have their own interests. And I don't mean that in a bad sense. I mean that just in the completely straightforward sense. They have their own histories and engagement and their own visions of like how we'll make the world a better place. And I like this case because I think it's relatively, I'll get myself in relatively little trouble kind of suggesting that this is part of what happened here. In a way that I get in a lot more trouble suggesting it in other situations. But there was already a lot of government drug money, law enforcement, drug enforcement money going into crystal meth at that time. So there was a kind of push to do research. And so there was money available to do research. And so there was a kind of open space made available for like well-meaning progressive science people. And I haven't traced this whole piece out, but the suddenness with which the crystal meth, anti-crystal meth programs, 12-step programs and other interventions appear after this kind of publicity is astonishing. And so you can only imagine that there was already a sort of programmatic work being done, and that this was an opportunity to kind of take the funds that were going to then flow, or the funds that are going to be redirected. One of the pieces that I won't present, but that is really, really clear in the both the fights with AIDS Committee of Toronto, and there was a certain amount of back and forth for gay men's health crisis, there was a kind of push to reorient all of the gay men's risk reduction stuff towards the crystal HIV connection, as if suddenly these are the most risky, the most dangerous, the most, and again, there's a hidden assumption in that, which is that these crazed HIV positive guys on crystal meth are going out spreading the virus to everybody and their brother. I'll contest that in the talk. Yeah. Because actually you become impotent from doing too much crystal meth. But there's a whole lot of there's a whole lot of knowledge about how crystal meth actually works on the ground that belies the kind of programs that people began trying to put into place, as if, oh, we know who those people are, even though those other people don't act that way. So there was a lot of kind of folk knowledge that did not align well with the way programs were rolling out. There's a follow-up study of 2006, I think, of the programs that were rolling out, I believe in Miami and New York. And it really shows this kind of attributional logic, as people in health psychology often talk about it, where the gay men who were interviewed about, like, did you see the campaign? Were like, oh yeah, I saw that. Those guys are bad. I use crystal, but I don't use it like that. So there was a lot of kind of reinforcement of that linkage, the bad gay men, crystal meth, HIV linkage, and yet a disavowal of being that kind of gay man, even though everyone else would be looking at you saying you're exactly the kind of person we're talking to, that we're aiming our campaign at. So again, it's got the same kind of quality that virtually every other, these kind of sudden, okay, we've got this one hook, and we'll do the education around that, has.
And for you, from what you see, the media, it's very general to say this, the media portrayal or media approach, have you seen it change over the years in this particular example in how AIDS and the connection to crystal meth or AIDS in general has changed for the press?
What happened specifically with crystal meth is the stories up until the superbug story are basically ripped from the press releases. They're not really elaborated very much. There are some longer, more elaborated stories earlier on about like crystal and crime that were apropos of the Janet Reno crystal meth task force in the late 1990s. When the crystal meth, and this is part of the reason why the story gets shaped in the way that it does, when the superbug thing happens, all of a sudden it's like, oh my God, let's cover this thing. So there's this kind of sudden shift away from simply basically replaying a press release to actually doing a little bit of journalism.
Investigative.
Yeah, but it's not too much investigation because the New York Department of Public Health actually provides a list of people to call, one of whom is the guy who did the 2004 very badly done literature review. So he takes on a kind of particularly vital role in this thing. He doesn't get quoted a huge amount. It gets quoted enough. Some of the good reporters have other people that they've already been talking to, all of whom are saying, this is really not a story. Joe Sonneman literally is quoted as saying, this isn't a story. So you have a kind of collision there of some of them are seasoned journalists who should have known better, but some of them are kind of new journalists. And in a sense, it's a crossover story because it had been a law and order kind of crime story, and now it's a AIDS story.
Right.
But there's a sudden kind of taking up of this as a story, and it goes on for about 9 months. So they've got their guys in the Department of Public Health that they're calling up. I would say that science and medical journalism in general, from say the late 70s to the present, has gone through a bunch of twists and turns that I might characterize as a decline. In the late 70s and 80s, there's a consolidation of a lot of small regional newspapers. They're bought up. In Canada, CanWest. Canada's a really, really good example of this. It happened a little less dramatically in the U.S. because there are just so many more newspapers. Many of the smaller papers that are trying to hang on to their circulation and stay independent newspapers buy more and more wire service stuff. And because medical reporting is very specialized, and it's not necessarily like every newspaper that comes out has a medical story, that was one of the first and easiest places to say, hey, let's get the Reuters stories on this. Reuters knows what they're doing. They'll give us good stuff. And then we'll get the local angle. So you started seeing a lot of reporters who didn't, they were okay. They weren't bad reporters, but they weren't really necessarily following medical science, generally speaking. So they didn't have a kind of big picture of here's where science is going. And then they'd call up whomever to get the local angle. So in the crystal stories, it's kind of amusing because they call the local public health people to get the local figures, but the local public health people are getting their figures from the Centers for Disease Control. So there's really no local here. And they represent the smaller newspapers who actually look at the published studies, represent them as national studies, when actually they're just studies from San Francisco and Miami. They're not national in the sense that you expect that term to mean occurring across the entire nation.
Right.
So the 80s, we see more and more of this kind of, somebody else other than a trained science journalist is doing the science pieces with, cued by either press releases or by Reuters or UPI stories. UPI had very good health people. Desktop publishing comes in. That facilitates the emergence of these little newsletters. And there are probably hundreds of them at one point with their little specialties.
Right.
being put together by people with science degrees for the most part, but not necessarily clinical experts, not necessarily super on top of doing the translational work to the range of their clients. I knew some of these folks, and I think they were, some of them were quite good, others were not so good. But again, greater and lesser degree of ability to say, that's a crazy press release. That just doesn't make any sense to me at all. Coming into the 2000s, you start getting internet-based stuff. So you have a faster ability to access things like the press releases and the secondary and tertiary representations of the science, but no ability to get the original articles, which are now still, locked away in the academic databases. By the late 2000s, you have really active blogging occurring. So you have people, who knows who they are, who state a certain kind of set of credentials and set of knowledge bases, but they are now accessible on par with these other, in some ways only slightly less iffy, but other secondary and tertiary kinds of reports. And now virtually all of it's on the web, because you have open access medical and science journals, which again have greater and lesser ability to do the editorial content work across the range of things that they're trying to do that work on. So
there's just a decrease. My impression is a decrease in science journalism as a specialization within journalism.
Yes, yeah. There are fewer and fewer clear niches for such people to go. So in the traditional, model, they were really terrific writers who had a medical and/or science degree.
Yeah.
Who really understood the science, at least at a high applied level. And then they were able to talk to the basic science researchers who were operating in some linguistic and conceptual universe of their own and sort of, make sense of that. Those people are fewer. So it's many more applied science people who already think they can translate. So there's a lot of translational stuff happening, like all throughout the whole process. Whereas in, at least my idealized memory of back in the day, it was a more kind of straight line. And the criticism was that there wasn't enough sort of democratized representation of science. Now it's almost like there's no standpoint from which to really judge the utility of things. So people cherry pick a lot of the, if you look at the programs, Crystal Meth, HIV programs, a lot of people have cherry picked their evidence.
Right. Because
they have to have evidence. They can't just say, it seems like a bad idea for you to take a lot of drugs. You do crazy things. And you have HIV to boot, which means you're not the healthiest guy on the planet. So, this seems like a bad idea. No, instead of just taking that approach, they've got a kind of, the social requirement is to trump it up with these partially cherry-picked facts.
Right. Thanks for chatting with us today, Dr. Patton, and thanks to all the listeners for tuning in. For more information on the Lives of Evidence National Lecture Series and upcoming events, check out situsci.ca. That's SITUSCI.ca.